Breaking news has just emerged from Ouagadougou that has sent shockwaves across the globe. Burkina Faso's president, Ibrahim Traoré, made a landmark decision this morning that has disrupted the international financial landscape. Events unfolding at the government palace in the capital have drawn widespread attention from economic observers worldwide. An extraordinary cabinet session, which began at 9 o'clock AM local time, was abruptly disrupted by unforeseen developments. President Traoré's directive marked a turning point not only for Burkina Faso, but also for the broader African region. This decisive action by the young president raises serious questions about the operations of global financial institutions in Africa. In pricing institutions, Politica's statement prompted open honesty, courage, and the imperative of action. The chain of events began last week with the findings of a special audit commission formed under Burkina Faso's Ministry of Finance. A group of young technocrats thoroughly examined the country's financial agreements with the World Bank. The results were alarming. According to the Commission's report, since 1960, Burkina Faso has paid back interest totaling 15 times the original loan amounts. Even more concerning was the revelation that many of these loans were tied to non-existent development projects. Roadworks, hospital construction, and school buildings that were never actually undertaken still appeared in official reports. Despite their absence in reality, payments were made regularly, interest accrued, and the country's debt burden increased dramatically. In-depth investigations by financial analysts unearthed highly sensitive documents. Confidential agreements signed between World Bank officials and former Burkinabe leaders. Evidence of bribery and covert deals surfaced one after another. Perhaps the most startling discovery was a secret 2019 agreement in which 40% of the nation's gold reserves were pledged as collateral to the World Bank. This agreement was made without any parliamentary approval or public knowledge. Professor Amadou Sawadogo, chair of the Audit Commission, stated in his report, "The people of Burkina Faso have endured systemic economic exploitation for over 50 years. The documents we hold confirm that this exploitation was not incidental, but part of a calculated, structured mechanism of plunder." When the dossier reached President Traoré, sources close to the palace say he reacted with visible fury. He immediately ordered that James Morrison, the World Bank's West Africa regional director, be summoned to the presidential palace. Morrison and his delegation arrived in the afternoon, unaware of what awaited them. Escorted under tight security, Morrison was led to the meeting room where President Traoré stood waiting. The stern look on his face underscored the gravity of the situation. What followed was a meeting of historic proportions. President Traoré began by placing the files firmly on the table. "Mr. Morrison," he said, "I have documents here that reveal how your institution has exploited my nation and its people for 5 decades. Phantom projects, inflated interest, and fabricated loans. Burkina Faso's stated debt is $4 billion, 0 cents. Yet we've already paid you $23 billion, 0 cents. How does that add up?" When Morrison tried to respond, Traoré cut him off sharply. "Don't speak to me about standard procedures, Mr. Morrison. This is orchestrated looting, and it ends now. I'm giving you 24 hours. Cancel these illegitimate debts and return what you've taken, or I'll have you and your team arrested for committing economic crimes." Morrison's attempt to invoke diplomatic immunity was swiftly rejected by Traoré. "You cannot commit economic crimes against humanity and expect to remain immune. The documents are now in my possession. The proof is undeniable. Our courts will deliver justice, and you will face the consequences you deserve." Following the meeting, Traoré addressed both national and international media. The press conference took place in the palace garden with the flag of Burkina Faso and a portrait of national hero Thomas Sankara behind him. His words quickly echoed across the globe. "To my fellow Burkinabe and to all African nations, this is a landmark moment. We are unveiling 5 decades of deception and exploitation. The global system of extraction operating under the name of the World Bank must come to an end. Our fathers were misled, our grandfathers betrayed, but this cycle ends with us. Africa's wealth belongs to its people, and no one has the right to take it from us." As Traoré displayed the documents to the media, a wave of astonishment swept through the press. Among the evidence were confidential agreements signed by past leaders, receipts for commissions, and financial records confirming bribery and illicit transactions. In the hours following the revelation, mass protests erupted across Ouagadougou. Thousands of citizens gathered in front of the World Bank office, chanting, "We want our money back." University students held signs in support of Traoré, while women took to the streets, beating pots and pans in protest. On social media, the hashtag #TavesWorldBank quickly began trending worldwide. Messages of encouragement poured in from across Africa. Many celebrated Traoré as a bold leader, finally confronting neocolonialism. Support soon followed from regional leaders. Mali's president, Assimi Goïta, was the first to publicly endorse Traoré. Burkina Faso is not standing alone. We too have endured this same system of exploitation. The moment has come to act together. Niger's leader, Abdourahmane Tiani, called for all Sahel nations to reassess their ties with the World Bank. Traoré's bravery should inspire us all. Africa is awakening and ready to reclaim what is rightfully hers. Guinea's president, Mamadi Doumbouya, echoed similar sentiments. Our brother Traoré is showing the right way forward. We are preparing to take similar action. Africans must take ownership of Africa's resources. Unexpected backing came from Uganda, where longtime President Yoweri Museveni praised the young leader's stance. What Traoré has done is what we should have done decades ago. It may be late, but it's the right course. In response, the World Bank convened an emergency meeting at its Washington headquarters. President Ajay Banga brought together all regional directors to assess the escalating situation. The primary concern: if Burkina Faso's bold action sparks a wider movement, it could endanger the World Bank's entire network across Africa. International tensions rise over Burkina Faso. Stand against the World Bank. IMF President Kristalina Georgieva issued an urgent appeal for moderation directed at Burkina Faso. However, her remarks sparked backlash across Africa. Many interpreted her statement as a reaction rooted in colonial anxiety. In response, the French government quickly activated diplomatic channels. President Macron's Africa advisor was dispatched to Ouagadougou, and the French Foreign Ministry issued a warning to President Traoré, but the young leader declined to meet the French delegation. His message was unequivocal. First, we'll resolve matters with the World Bank, then we'll address our issues with you. A statement from the US State Department added to the controversy. It read, "We expect Burkina Faso to adhere to international norms." African analysts criticized this, describing the so-called norms as modern-day colonial mechanisms. Events escalated in the afternoon. James Morrison, a senior World Bank representative, attempted to leave the country discreetly. But President Traoré had anticipated this. Special security forces intercepted Morrison at the airport, seized his passport, and escorted him back to the presidential palace. Meanwhile, Beijing's reaction drew global attention. China voiced its support, affirming that every nation's right to economic sovereignty must be upheld. The China Development Bank offered Burkina Faso interest-free loans, a move that unsettled Western governments. Russia's response was the strongest. Moscow accused the World Bank of engaging in neo-colonial practices in Africa. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov commended Traoré's defiance, stating, "African nations have every right to chart their own path." Later that evening, a major leak hit social media. Confidential World Bank documents surfaced online, revealing systematic efforts to trap African nations in cycles of debt. The document, titled "Strategy to Keep Poor Countries in Debt Forever," quickly went viral. Its contents were damning, detailing bribes to African officials, specific bank accounts used for illicit transfers, manipulation of media narratives, and efforts to silence dissenting voices. By midnight, Burkina Faso's security forces had acted. All World Bank offices in Ouagadougou were sealed, safes were seized, and sensitive documents were handed over to the prosecutor. President Traoré declared that these materials would serve as evidence in legal proceedings. The African Union convened an emergency summit in Addis Ababa. Of the 53 member states, 41 voted to support Traoré. A commission was formed to reassess the continent's relationship with the World Bank. The president of the African Development Bank called for Africa to create its own financial institutions. Throughout the night, citizens in Ouagadougou flooded the streets. Demonstrators held a vigil outside the World Bank office, chanting slogans such as, "We won't let Morrison escape." Fires were lit for warmth. Murals with the words, "Our hero leader," were painted across the city. Western media attempted to reshape the narrative. CNN International labeled Traoré a populist. BBC World Service warned of an impending economic collapse, and the Financial Times ran the headline, "Burkina Faso commits economic suicide." In contrast, African media outlets reported developments with a focus on transparency and national sovereignty. As the 24-hour ultimatum given to Morrison neared its end, mixed reports emerged from Washington. Some insiders suggested the World Bank was prepared to compromise, while others indicated an economic embargo might be imposed on Burkina Faso. At sunrise, the world watched a historic scene unfold in Ouagadougou. Morrison was brought back to the presidential palace. Journalists filled the room. President Traoré sat composed, awaiting the final word. Morrison, visibly shaken, addressed the room. "I've spoken with headquarters. They've agreed to restructure the debt. There will be a 50% reduction." Traoré shook his head. "We don't want restructuring. We demand full cancellation and the return of the stolen $23 billion. 0 cents. Morrison turned pale. "That's impossible. The World Bank doesn't have that kind of authority." Traoré stood. "Then you are under arrest, Mr. Morrison. You will face trial for economic war crimes." At his signal, security officers moved in. For the first time in history, a World Bank executive was detained. As Morrison protested, "I have diplomatic immunity," Traoré responded coldly, "There is no immunity for those who commit crimes against nations." Morrison and his 5-person team were transferred to Ouagadougou Central Prison. Once the footage aired globally, financial markets reacted with shock. World Bank stock dropped by 12%, and Western banks operating in Africa entered crisis mode. At noon, Traoré addressed over 100,000 citizens gathered in Thomas Sankara Square. "Brothers and sisters, today marks the day of our true independence. Never again will we allow others to steal our future or our wealth. Our gold belongs to us. Our uranium is ours. We will use these resources to benefit our people." Throughout the speech, the crowd responded with enthusiastic applause. Chants of "Long live independent Burkina Faso" echoed through the air. Support messages from across Africa were read aloud. Young girls performed traditional dances, while elders prayed with tears in their eyes. This event marked a pivotal moment not only for Burkina Faso but for the entire continent. It signaled a shift. African countries would no longer be the same. Institutions like the World Bank would no longer operate freely in Africa, as leaders like Traoré emerged with bold new visions. The ripple effects were felt across the region. Similar movements began gaining traction in other African nations. In Senegal, Ivory Coast, youth flooded the streets. The opposition demanded an end to World Bank agreements. In Ghana, university students organized protest marches. Traoré's bold stance triggered a domino effect. Africa was beginning to awaken. Colonial-era economic dependencies were now being challenged. Young leaders were gaining confidence. People were rising to claim their rights. The World Bank faced unprecedented scrutiny. The arrest of Morrison deeply damaged the institution's credibility. If more African countries followed suit, the World Bank's role in Africa could effectively vanish. Traoré quickly became a symbol, not just for Burkina Faso, but for oppressed communities everywhere. Despite his youth, his courage and resolve inspired millions. The global order was beginning to shift, and Ibrahim Traoré was emerging as one of its key figures. What lies ahead remains uncertain. Will the World Bank retreat? Will Traoré take even bolder action? Will Morrison face trial? Will other African countries follow this path? Answers to these questions will unfold in the coming days. Traoré's actions also affected global power dynamics. BRICS nations responded quickly in support. Indian Prime Minister Modi stated, "We support Africa's rightful struggle." Brazilian President Lula da Silva called for unity against imperialism. South African President Ramaphosa invited Traoré to Pretoria. Voices of dissent also began to emerge within the European Union. Lawmakers from Spain and Portugal questioned the World Bank's policies in Africa. Italian senators sent a letter of support to Traoré. In Germany, the Die Linke party declared, "We support Africa's legitimate demands." Back in Burkina Faso, the mood was celebratory. School children drew portraits of Traoré. Market vendors exclaimed, "We sent the World Bank packing." Special prayers were held in both mosques and churches. Elders remarked, "We haven't seen a leader like this since Thomas Sankara." Footage of Morrison's arrest captured the shock on his face as he was placed in a prison vehicle, hands cuffed. Though Western media largely avoided airing the clips, they went viral on social platforms. African youth reacted, "This is history in the making." In a surprising gesture, Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro offered Burkina Faso discounts on fuel, stating the Bolivarian Revolution was resonating in Africa. Cuban President Díaz-Canel pledged to send doctors and educators. Iran's foreign minister expressed that the axis of resistance against imperialism was expanding. As tension mounted, anxiety spread rapidly among World Bank staff. Hundreds of specialists stationed across Africa began relocating their family. In Kenya, the World Bank office tightened its security protocols. Staff in Nigeria started taking personal leave, while the regional center in Ethiopia halted its operations entirely. Meanwhile, panic gripped Wall Street. Investment funds focused on Africa experienced sharp declines. Commodity markets grew unstable, with gold prices hitting historic highs. Analysts began referring to this growing unease as the Traoré effect. In Burkina Faso, intelligence teams uncovered even more incriminating files from Morrison's computer. A decade's worth of emails exposed how African leaders had been bribed. Documents revealed coup strategies, assassination lists, and covert operations. In response, the Provisional Revolutionary Authority decided to submit this evidence to the International Court of Justice. Across France, the African diaspora mobilized. Massive demonstrations took place, with tens of thousands rallying in Paris and Lyon in support of Traoré. Burkinabe students held vigils outside consulates, while celebrations broke out in African communities in Marseille. Support extended across the Atlantic as well. Members of the U.S. Congress began speaking out. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, from the Democratic Party's progressive wing, called for reforms at the World Bank. Senator Bernie Sanders voiced solidarity, saying, "I recognize the just struggle of African people." Even Republican Senator Rand Paul remarked that foreign aid needed reevaluation. In Turkey, while officials issued measured statements, public support surged. Social media users expressed admiration for Traoré. Commentators began to argue that Turkey, with its deep historical links to Africa, should take a more prominent role. By contrast, countries like Japan and South Korea remained officially silent. However, scholars from both nations voiced support. Professor Yamamoto of Tokyo University stated, "Africa's renaissance is underway." Dr. Hakim Park from Seoul added that this moment could mark the beginning of a new global order. On the ground in Burkina Faso, the army had achieved what many described as a complete victory. Soldiers demonstrated unwavering loyalty to Traoré. High-ranking generals declared their pride in the young leader, while pilots flew overhead in displays of celebration. The public welcomed and stood with the military. One thing has become undeniably clear: Africa is entering a new chapter. Fresh leadership will emerge in the wake of Traoré's example. The long-standing system of exploitation is being dismantled, and African nations are poised to claim the prosperity they have long been denied. Ibrahim Traoré is set to be remembered as the courageous leader who helped turn that vision into reality.